Imagine living next to someone for years, sharing laughter, silences, and small routines, without ever imagining that that person holds secrets that could turn your life upside down. This is the story of John Ellison, a calm, almost invisible man who never spoke of his past. The curtains in his house were always closed, and any attempt to get close seemed to bump into an invisible wall. Have you ever met someone like this? Someone who seems to carry the weight of the world without ever revealing what really happened. We often think we know people, but the truth is, every life has secrets that time insists on hiding. And what happens when these secrets are discovered by chance? That's exactly what happened to Grace Carson, a curious and empathetic young woman who never imagined that a simple envelope mixed up in the mail would forever change a mysterious man's life, and hers as well. As she investigated small clues, Grace began to realize that John's past was not only painful, but also held a story of love, loss, and choices that no one could understand at first glance. What makes someone hide so much of their past? Fear, guilt, or simply the need to protect someone they love? And most importantly, is it possible to confront that past without upsetting the delicate balance of the present? In this story, you'll follow every detail. John's prolonged silence, the lost letters, the fire no one understood, and Grace's quest to uncover a seemingly impossible truth. And just when everything seemed about to unfold, something unexpected changes the course of the narrative. Stay with me until the end, because in this video, you will not only discover the man who never spoke about his past, but also understand how a single coincidence can transform lives, open wounds, heal them, and even reveal the love and courage that remain hidden in the shadows. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and get ready to dive into an intense, exciting story full of surprises. What no one has been able to explain. No one in the small town of Willow Creek, interior of the United States, knew for sure who that was mysterious man who lived in the house on the hill. Some said he was a former teacher, others that he had been a war doctor. The truth is that John Ellison, he never talked about his past. The curtains in his house were always closed, and the sound of an old piano was the only thing that sometimes escaped through the window on cold nights. John walked every morning to the same cafe downtown. He always sat at the same table, ordered the same black coffee, and read the same local newspaper. He was polite and kind, but maintained a subtle distance, as if there were an invisible wall between him and the rest of the world. People greeted him respectfully, but there was something about him that awakened curiosity and discomfort at the same time. Over time, his figure became a kind of living legend. Children invented stories. Adults made bets on what he was hiding. Was he a widower, a deserter, a rich man fleeing fame? No one knew. That mysterious man seemed to carry the weight of something that could not be said. And it was by chance, a simple twist of fate, that the veil of silence began to tear. A misplaced delivery, a persistent look, and an old photograph were the trigger for a chain of events that would change everything Willow Creek thought she knew about John Ellison. But until that moment, no one imagined that that secret of the past was too big to be hidden. The hidden life John's was not just a mystery. It was an open wound, waiting to be touched by chance. As the morning mist shrouded the city and the church bell tolled 8, something new was about to begin. And like all good stories, no one noticed the first sign. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. You won't want to miss what happens when John Ellison's past finally comes knocking, between routines and shadows. In that town where everyone knew everyone else's business, it was almost an insult for someone like that to exist. John Ellison, the mysterious man that seemed to come from nowhere. He lived like a human clock, every gesture timed, every step measured. At 7 o'clock sharp, the lamp in his living room would come on. At 7:30 the door would open, and he would walk slowly to the cafe on the corner, the same cafe that over the years had become a silent part of his story. The owner of the place, Sam Baldwin, had already tried to strike up a conversation dozens of times, but John always responded with the same restrained kindness, a half smile that seemed to say, "Thanks, but don't insist." Sam was telling customers about how he once dropped a comment about the weather and heard a response that stuck with him. The climate changes what is outside, but it is what we have inside that decides whether it rains or shines. Since then, Sam said that mysterious man, he spoke little, but when he did, he seemed to carry an entire world within one sentence. At the cafe, John always observed people. The couple arguing quietly, the young mother arriving with her baby, the mailman who seemed to be racing against time. He observed but never judged. He simply watched, as if he had seen every facet of human pain and had learned that silence is sometimes the best response. There were those who said that John had a hidden life, who perhaps received letters under false names or hid money in the basement. But the truth was simpler and, at the same time, deeper. He was simply protecting himself. The past had left too many scars, and deep down he believed that those who spoke little suffered less. Sometimes on windy nights someone would see a light on in their room until very late, and in the distance they could hear the keys of a piano playing a slow, melancholic, yet curiously beautiful melody. They said it was the same song, always the same, a kind of personal hymn, a lament no one understood. Once a neighbor named Martha Coleman, a kind and talkative lady, she decided to bring John a plate of pie, as if trying to break down a wall with kindness. He thanked her politely, but didn't invite her in. However, Martha noticed something. In the corner of the room, on the unlit fireplace, there was a frame upside down, a photograph he didn't want to show. When she left, she commented to her friend, "That man has something he wants to hide, but maybe what he hides is what hurts him the most." Time passed, the seasons changed, and John continued with his precise, repetitive, almost hypnotic rhythm. The secret of the past seemed to sleep with him every night and wake up next to him every morning. But what no one noticed was that within that meticulous silence, something was beginning to change. Small, almost imperceptible signs began to appear. A letter left open on the table, an old coat hanging on the wrong side of the door, and a gaze that lingered too long on the window. The usual breakfast began to lose its flavor. The piano, once calmly played, now sounded anxious. John looked at his hands as if they held questions he could no longer answer. And then, for the first time in 20 years, he did something out of character. He didn't show up for breakfast. The absence was felt. In the small world of Willow Creek, where every face was part of a single book, a blank page caught the eye. Sam asked the customers if anyone had seen him. Martha glanced out the window uneasily. And the children, who used to play Find Mr. Ellison's Secret, ran up the hill to spy on his house. Everything seemed the same, the curtains closed, the garden silent, the mailbox empty. But something was different. A faint, muffled sound coming from inside the house, the sound of paper being ripped. That morning marked the beginning of a chain of events that no one could have predicted, because when a mysterious man resolves to face his own hidden life, the entire destiny stirs, as if time were breathing again after standing still for a long time. And the curious thing is that the first hint of the truth wouldn't come from John. It would come from someone he would never have imagined having any connection to him. A young woman who by chance would receive a letter addressed to the wrong name. But this story, like everything involving secrets, was just beginning to unfold. When the silence began to speak the next day, the absence of John Ellison in the cafe continued to be the main topic of conversation in town. The mysterious man that was never missing had simply disappeared for an entire day. To any other resident, this wouldn't have been news, But to someone whose routine was a religion, it was almost an earthquake. Sam Baldwin, the cafe owner, stared at the empty chair by the window. It was as if the air had grown heavier. He tried to convince himself that John might be sick or out of town, but deep down he sensed something strange was about to happen, something that would somehow shake the calm of Willow Creek. The next morning, however, John reappeared. He walked into the cafe as if nothing had happened. The same firm step, the same distant look, but there was something subtly off. He was hatless, and his hair, now greyer, looked disheveled, as if he'd been up all night. No. He sat down, ordered his usual, but didn't open the newspaper. He stared outside, observing the hustle and bustle of the street, an expression of nostalgia mixed with weariness. Sam, trying to break the ice, commented, "Beautiful day today, Mr. Ellison." John took a deep breath, taking a few seconds before answering, "It's beautiful. But time has these things. It shows the light only to remind us of what was lost in the shadows." That sentence stuck in Sam's head, and in the heads of everyone nearby, because, for the first time, mysterious man had let something slip, a hint of what appeared to be a secret of the past, kept for too long. In the days that followed, John began to change little things. He'd leave the newspaper on the table, unfinished. He'd stop by the florist, where he'd never been before, and buy a single flower, always the same species, white lilies. The owner of the store, a sweet lady named Margaret, even asked if it was for a birthday. He simply replied, "It's to remember someone who doesn't want to be forgotten." With each gesture, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. It was as if, suddenly, the silence began to speak in flowers, in glances, in small deviations from custom, and with it came questions no one had the courage to ask aloud. One night, Martha Coleman, the neighbor, heard a strange sound coming from the house on the hill. It wasn't the piano this time. It was a voice, faint but clear. John was talking to himself. He kept repeating a name, Anna, over and over again, as if trying to convince himself that she could still hear. The next day, a young woman named Grace Carson, an intern at the post office, made a simple mistake. She mixed up 2 letters during deliveries. One of them was addressed to John Ellison, and curiously, the envelope bore the postmark of a hospital in New York. The name on the return address, however, wasn't his. It belonged to someone named Anna Lewis. Grace realized her mistake too late. When she returned to John's house to correct it, he was already on the porch, holding the letter in his hands, pale. She apologized, trying to explain, but he just smiled, with a serenity that was frightening. "Don't worry, miss. Sometimes fate needs to get confused to remind us of who we were." That letter opened a rift. After that day, John became even more isolated. The piano stopped playing. The lights, which had previously come on punctually, now stayed off for hours at a time. The town began to whisper again, and the rumors gained momentum. They said he had been married, that he had lost his wife in a fire, or that he had fled a tragedy he never overcame. But the truth was much deeper, and no one imagined that Grace herself, the mail girl, would be the key to discovering what was behind that hidden life. She began to notice the details. The way John held the envelope, the way his eyes welled up whenever anyone mentioned New York. Intrigued, she decided to investigate. Not out of malicious curiosity, but because of a strange feeling that the man was asking for help without saying a word. It was then that Grace found something unexpected. In the mail register, the name Anna Lewis was listed as the recipient of an old letter sent more than 20 years ago, and the sender on that occasion was John Ellison himself. A shiver ran through his body. The mysterious man wasn't just hiding a secret. He was waiting for an answer, one that might never have come. What if that exchanged letter wasn't a mistake? What if, somehow, fate had decided to correct a 2-decade delay? Grace didn't know it, But she was about to become involved in something much bigger than just a simple correspondence. The secret of the past was beginning to emerge, and the silence surrounding John Ellison finally began to speak. But what came next wouldn't be a simple revelation. It would be a journey, a search, not for answers, but for redemption. Echoes of a forgotten past. Since the day the exchanged letter reached the hands of John Ellison, the young woman Grace Carson, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Something about that scene, his serene gaze, his weary voice, the way he held the envelope like a relic, had stuck in her mind. She couldn't explain why, but she felt that mysterious man needed to be understood, not just observed from a distance like everyone else did. Grace was naturally curious, but unlike most of Willow Creek's inhabitants, her curiosity was accompanied by empathy. She was 27 years old, lived alone, and had worked at the post office for a little over a year. Raised by her grandmother, she had grown up listening to old stories, believing that fate sometimes sent signs disguised as coincidence. And at that moment, Grace was certain that the switched envelope was one of those signs. That same week, while organizing her mail files, she found records of old correspondence from New York, all addressed to John Ellison, but never answered. They were letters that appeared to have been returned, stamped "Addressee not found," and the return address was always the same: Anna Lewis. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. This woman was somehow part of the secret of the past of John. But who was Anna Lewis? A lost wife, a daughter, a friend? She didn't know, but there was something in that connection that pulsed, as if the universe itself were whispering, "Discover." The following Sunday, Grace decided to climb the hill. The cold afternoon wind swayed the trees, and dry leaves crunched beneath her footsteps. When she reached the front door, she hesitated. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with a strange anticipation, as if she were about to open a door into time. John greeted her as calmly as ever. His gaze was kind, but distant. With a lump in her throat, she held one of the old letters she'd found in the records. "Mr. Ellison, I found this by chance. I thought you might want to see it." He fell silent. Time seemed to stop. With trembling hands, he picked up the envelope and looked at it as if he were meeting a ghost. "Grace, you shouldn't have bothered." "I'm sorry, sir, but who is Anna Lewis?" she asked, almost in a whisper. He took a while to answer. He walked to the window, looked at the horizon, and said, "Anna was the sun I let set, without fighting for it to rise again." Grace didn't understand right away, but those words carried the weight of a confession. He didn't explain anything further. He simply thanked her and asked her to leave. But when she turned away, she saw something on the table that made her stop. An old, faded photograph of a young woman smiling next to a man in military uniform. The man was John, many years younger. From that day forward, Grace began his own quiet investigation. He combed through records, read old newspapers, and consulted local library archives. He discovered that John Ellison had been a lieutenant in the U.S. Army during the 1970s, and that, after leaving the service, he had lived in New York for a few years. After that, nothing. He disappeared from the records as if time had swallowed him whole. The more he discovered, the more questions arose. Why had he moved to Willow Creek? What had happened to Anna? And why hadn't her letters found him? With each clue, Grace felt more drawn in, not just by the story, but by a strange sense of duty, as if she had been chosen to give voice to that silence. One night, rummaging through the digitized archives of a New York newspaper, Grace came across a short note from 1985. "Fire in Manhattan residential building leaves one person dead. Identified as Anna Lewis, 28. His heart raced. His hands sweated. Anna Lewis had died. And the most frightening thing was the address of the building, the same one as the last letter sent by John Ellison before he disappeared. Grace felt the pieces begin to fall into place. The mysterious man. He had not fled from a crime, nor from a war, but from himself. He had fled from a pain that time could not erase. Determined to understand more, she returned to the house on the hill the next morning. John was in the garden, calmly watering the plants. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Mr. Ellison, I read about Anna." He stopped moving, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "So now you know." His voice trembled. For the first time, the calm, confident tone gave way to fragility. Grace said nothing. She just stood there, feeling that any word would be disrespectful in that moment. He then whispered, "She died, waiting for an answer that never came. I was there, but I couldn't save her." The weight of those words made the air around them feel thicker. Grace felt like crying, but she held back her tears. At that moment he understood something. The secret of the past. John Ellison's wasn't just a memory, it was an emotional prison, a guilt that had held him hostage for decades. Before saying goodbye, Grace asked, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "Because sometimes, Grace, the past is the only place where we can still talk to those who are gone." That answer echoed in her mind for days. And it was in this echo that the decision that would change everything was born. Grace would go to New York to discover the complete truth about Anna Lewis, even if John didn't want to. She didn't know it yet, but this trip would open a new chapter in history, one that would not only lead to the past, but to a turnaround no one expected. And what was found in New York? The decision to Grace Carson. Her decision to travel to New York wasn't impulsive. She knew she was getting into something delicate, maybe even dangerous. But there was something about that mysterious man that moved her, a mixture of compassion and fascination. It was as if fate had chosen her to be the guardian of a secret that finally needed to be set free. Before he left a note for John Ellison, simple and direct. "I will look for her, Mr. Ellison, not for what you are hiding, but for what you still need to find." He never responded, but Grace sensed that somehow he knew this search needed to happen. Arriving in New York was a shock to her. The city was the opposite of Willow Creek, noisy, vibrant, and bustling. And yet, amid the chaos, there was a different silence, the silence of forgotten stories. Grace rented a simple room in an old hotel near the neighborhood where the 1985 fire had occurred. On the first day, he went to the address of Anna Lewis's old building. The parking space was now a parking lot. The doorman of the building next door, a friendly gentleman named Harold, he vaguely remembered the tragedy. "Yes, I remember that. A young lady, very sweet, an artist, if I'm not mistaken. The fire started in her apartment. They said it was accidental, but, at the time, no one really asked." Grace asked if he remembered a man named John Ellison. Harold frowned and replied, "Ah, that name. Yes, I think he lived with her for a while. Then he disappeared out of nowhere, the same week as the fire. They said he had traveled. Others swore they saw him leaving before the fire, but no one knows for sure." Each answer left Grace more intrigued. The secret of the past seemed to be unfolding, piece by piece, but there were still gaps. Something didn't add up. In the following days, Grace visited libraries, registry offices, and public archives. She found an old and unclear piece of news. Man injured in fire, reported missing. No name, no photo. But the date, March 13th, 1985, was the same as Anna's accident. It was then that she discovered something that would completely change her perspective on what really happened. A medical report, filed in the records of St. Mary's Hospital, mentioned a patient admitted the same night as the fire. The patient's name? John Ellis. Grace froze. John Ellis. Ellison. A single letter's difference. Could it be possible that the hospital had registered the wrong name? She continued reading. The report stated that the patient had burns on his arm and head trauma, and that he had disappeared before being discharged. His heart raced. John Ellison had not fled after the fire. He had outlived him. The pain he carried wasn't just the guilt of not saving Anna, it was the guilt of having lost her so brutally, of having watched her die before his eyes and yet still remaining alive. With trembling hands, Grace copied the registration number from the report and, with the help of a hospital staff member, located an old file of transferred patients. There, she found a note. Patient transferred for psychological treatment at Willow Psychiatric Institute. Voluntary discharge, 1986. Willow Creek, the city where he lives to this day. Grace felt a shiver run through her body. Everything was connected. He hadn't chosen Willow Creek by chance. This place was the end of one journey and perhaps the beginning of another. The next day she went to the old institute building. Today it was a community school, but the hospital archives had been preserved. An elderly nurse, Mrs. Porter, remembered the name immediately. Ah, John. Yes, I knew him. A kind man, very quiet. He talked about a woman all the time, Anna. He said she appeared in his dreams and asked him to forgive the fire. Grace shivered. And what happened to him? He was discharged, said he was going to start his life over. He asked to be forgotten. Leaving there, Grace sat on a park bench, trying to process everything. The mysterious man had spent years in treatment, trying to deal with a trauma the world never knew existed. And in a way, that hidden life, it was an attempt to pay an impossible emotional debt. She looked up at the cloudy sky and thought about how fate sometimes weaves stories together with invisible threads. John Ellison wasn't just a lonely man. He was the survivor of a love that burned too hot to live. Before returning to Willow Creek, Grace decided to visit one last place, Green Hill Cemetery, where, according to records, Anna Lewis was buried. Before the simple headstone, with her name engraved in delicate script, she laid a white lily, the same flower John bought every week. As he knelt down, he murmured softly, "He still thinks about you, Anna, every day." The wind blew lightly, as if a presence responding from a distance said, "I know." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the tears fall. She knew she had to go back. Because at Willow Creek, a man was waiting, and this time he would have to hear what fate had brought back from the ashes. When the truth changed, everything back in Willow Creek, the air felt thicker, almost heavy. Grace carried in her suitcase the papers that could explain everything and at the same time destroy the little piece John Ellison had built. The train moved slowly through the morning mist, and she could feel her heartbeat thudding in time with the tracks, as if each beat were a countdown to an inevitable moment. On the way, she reread the hospital report. Each line seemed more vivid, more painful. John, or Ellis, had been admitted in critical condition, with burns, disoriented, mumbling Anna's name. The chart said he woke up 3 days after the fire and remembered almost nothing, only the sound of the fire and a scream. But something at the end of the report caught Grace's attention. There was a footnote, barely legible. Unidentified female body found in the alley next to the building. No remains consistent with the victim, Anna Lewis. Grace's heart almost stopped. If that body, it wasn't Anna's, so who was buried in her place? Suddenly, everything seemed to fall apart. The truth that had once seemed so solid began to crumble like a house built on sand. Grace knew what she needed to do: return to the cemetery, compare the records, check the grave. But first, there was something more urgent: tell John what she had discovered. That afternoon, the sky darkened prematurely. The wind blew dry leaves through the narrow streets, and the distant sound of church bells mingled with the rustling of the trees. Grace walked to his house, her briefcase in her arms, her soul heavy with doubts. John was sitting on the porch, as always, staring into the distance. When he saw her, he just smiled slightly. That tired, resigned smile, one that no longer expected good news. "You're back," he said. "Yes, I am back. And I need you to listen to me calmly." She sat down across from him, spread out the papers, and began to tell him what she had learned in New York. As the words left his mouth, John's face changed. First, surprise, then confusion, finally, fear. "That can't be true," he murmured, his hands shaking. "I saw the body. I held her in my arms." Grace took a deep breath. "Mr. Ellison, there's evidence that the body wasn't hers. There's evidence of an unidentified woman being found at the scene, but the proper examination was never performed. There may have been a mistake, confusion, perhaps even a cover-up." John was silent for what seemed like an eternity. The sound of rain began to fall outside, hitting the roof with a hypnotic rhythm. Finally, he whispered, "So she could be alive." Those words hung in the air, like a spark about to ignite what remained of reason. Grace didn't respond. He couldn't promise something he didn't know. But the gleam in his eyes, a mixture of hope and dread, was enough to tell her that this man was about to plunge once again into the abyss of his past. In the following days, John barely slept. He returned to painting compulsively, as if each brushstroke could open a door to what was hidden. The canvases began to change. Once somber and sad, they now featured female forms, half-faded faces like distant memories. One night, Grace heard a knock on the door. It was John, wet from the rain, panting, holding a yellowed letter. "I found this," he said, his voice trembling. The letter was hidden deep in one of the old ink boxes. The handwriting was feminine and delicate, but the paper smelled of stale smoke. Grace began to read aloud. "John, if you're reading this, I may not have made it. But if the fire spared me, I promise I'll come back. I don't want you to look for me. I don't want you to suffer for me. It wasn't your fault. The fire was my punishment. I needed to disappear so you could live." "Anna." Grace looked up, startled. She knew. John wept silently. "I never knew she left it. I thought I had lost her forever. But she wanted to disappear." The weight of those words was almost unbearable. The fire hadn't just been a tragedy. It had been a planned escape. Anna, for some still hidden reason, needed to disappear. And the fire was her final curtain. Anna. Grace's mind began to connect the dots. The unidentified woman, the letter, Anna's sudden disappearance. Everything pointed to something much bigger than an accident. Maybe someone wanted her dead. Or maybe she needed to protect someone. Maybe even John himself. That night changed everything. John began to speak more clearly about the past, remembering forgotten details. A man who frequented the building, a heated argument, an unpaid debt. Grace began to write everything down. The story was no longer a simple tragic romance. It was becoming a royal mystery, with loose pieces that finally began to fit together. But there was something Grace didn't tell John. On her last day in New York, before flying back, she had received an anonymous envelope left under her hotel room door. Inside was a single photograph, a woman in profile, walking down a sunny street in Paris. In the handwritten caption, "Anna Lewis, Montmartre, 1994. Grace kept the photo a secret. It wasn't time to show it yet. Anna's secret, what no one imagined. For days, Grace kept the photograph hidden in a box, along with the letter and hospital documents. She tried to convince herself that perhaps it was a mistake, a coincidence, a similar woman. But deep down, something inside her whispered that it wasn't. That image, taken years after the fire, clearly depicted Anna Lewis. Alive, different, but unmistakable. John, for his part, seemed to be reborn. He spent hours in his studio, painting non-stop, as if the flame of life had been rekindled. His works now took on colors. Intense reds, golds and blues. He called it the light after the darkness. Grace couldn't bring herself to destroy this small spark of hope that finally brought him out of his silence. But fate seemed impatient. One afternoon, while visiting the town's small library, Grace noticed something that made her freeze. A temporary exhibition called Shadows and Lights of Montmartre, with anonymous artists who had lived in seclusion in Paris in the 1990s. Among the exhibition catalogues, one name caught his attention, A.L. Monroe. She leafed through the book with trembling hands until she saw it, a watercolor self-portrait signed A.L. Monroe. The face, the look, the same look John had painted dozens of times. It was Anna. Suddenly everything made sense. The name Monroe, Anna's maiden name, the city, Paris, the time period, post-fire. She had not only survived, she had reinvented her life. Grace felt her heart race. What if Anna was still alive? What if, for some reason, he had faked his own death to escape something or someone? The questions consumed her, but now she had a solid clue. She decided not to tell John yet. She needed confirmation. Silently, she began planning her trip. She sold some of her pottery, bought a ticket, and set off for France, carrying the photograph and a copy of the letter in her suitcase. Arriving in Paris, the cold November air bit her face like a bitter memory. Grace walked the narrow streets of Montmartre, observing every face, every shop window, every studio. The bohemian neighborhood pulsated with art and mystery. She asked about A.L. Monroe at several galleries, but no one seemed to know who he was. Until, in a small framing shop, an elderly gentleman replied in broken English, "Ah, yes. She lived there, on Rue Lepic, a very kind, discreet woman. She disappeared a few years ago." Grace felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She had been there, alive. Guided by intuition, she went to the address. The building was old, with a blue facade and windows covered by white curtains. Inside, the caretaker recognized the description and confirmed. Mrs. Monroe lived here for over 10 years. She said she had been a painter in New York, but one day she just left. "Where did you go?" Grace asked anxiously. The man thought for a moment. He talked about going home. That answer echoed in his mind like silent thunder. Return home. Had Anna returned to the United States? To Willow Creek? Grace boarded the first flight back, her soul in turmoil. Arriving in the small town, she went straight to John's house, but found the gate ajar. She knocked, but no one answered. She entered slowly, the sound of the creaking floorboards betraying each step. The studio was silent. On the table, a new painting, a portrait of a woman walking through a field with the sun setting behind her. In the bottom corner of the screen, John had signed, "To Grace, thank you for helping me see what I didn't want to see." Grace felt a shiver. John wasn't there. On the table was an envelope with his name on it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Grace, if you're reading this, it's because I've found what I've been looking for. Don't worry about me. Life gave me a second chance, and now I understand that true love isn't about possessing, but about liberating. I've discovered what Anna did and why she did it. She saved me. She came back a few years ago quietly to make sure I was okay, and when she realized I was, she left again. Maybe she's still out there somewhere, living in peace. That's what I want too. Don't look for me." Grace's hands were shaking. Silent tears were streaming down her face. Anna had returned, and no one would notice. John had seen her perhaps only once, and that had been enough to put him to rest. She walked out of the house slowly, feeling the wind on her face, the scent of the garden flowers still in the air. The mystery, after all, wasn't about what John was hiding, but about what Anna sacrificed so that he could live in peace. That night, sitting on the park bench, Grace looked up at the starry sky and understood that not all secrets need to be revealed. Some are like silent notes of an ancient song, which only have meaning to those who have heard them up close. The man who never spoke of his past in the end, "I just wanted to protect someone's future." And Grace now carried the weight and beauty of that truth, a secret she would never tell, but one that would forever change the way she viewed love and forgiveness. But then, as the church clock struck midnight, something unexpected happened. A car stopped on the other side of the square. A woman got out wearing a hat and scarf around her neck and walked slowly to the gate of John's house. Grace held her breath. Even from a distance he recognized the walk, the gesture of adjusting the scarf. Era Anna. What remains after the silence? The moon reflected softly on the quiet streets of Willow Creek. Grace remained in the square, sitting on the bench where she had so often reflected on John Ellison's past. Everything that had once seemed impossible now had clear outlines. The fire, the letter, the lost letters, the trip to New York, Anna's reinvented life. Everything fit together, as if time had stitched the story together with invisible threads. The cool wind caressed her face, bringing the distant scent of flowers from John's garden. She finally understood that the mystery lay not only in the gaps of the past, but in the way each choice, each silence, and each secret shaped lives that often seemed separated by fate, but were in fact intrinsically linked. Grace felt a mixture of relief and nostalgia. John, now at peace with his past, still remained a reserved figure, but his colors returned, not in words but in paintings, in small actions, in the subtle gestures of someone who had found the emotional freedom he had carried for decades. She thought of Anna, that brave woman who disappeared to protect someone she loved. That woman who chose life, liberty, and anonymity, even if it meant never being seen again. Grace understood that some secrets don't need to be revealed to be respected. Sometimes true love is silent, invisible, and eternal. As the night wore on, Grace reflected on the power of empathy and the courage to face the truth. He realized that each of us carries untold stories, hidden pain, and choices that seem impossible to understand from the outside. But when someone is willing to listen, with an open heart, without judgment, quiet miracles can happen. The city was quiet. But in the silence, Grace felt something continue to move. Something that time, distance, and even fire could not erase. The connection between lives, the impact of small gestures, and the strength of those who choose to forgive and let go. She looked up at the starry sky and asked herself a question, and a question for everyone who looks to the past to understand the present. How many secrets do we carry that could transform not only our lives, but the lives of those we love, if we had the courage to confront them? Grace stood, took a deep breath and smiled, feeling an unexpected lightness. There were no complete answers. There was only the beauty of realizing that even in the gaps of the past, it is possible to find meaning, peace, and inspiration to move forward. And you, who've followed this story thus far, what would you do if you discovered a secret that could change everything you believed about someone you love? Leave your answer in the comments. Share your thoughts, experiences, and emotions. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories like this, which touch, move, and make you think about what truly matters. Because in the end, we all have a past, and how we deal with it defines who we are.